Gillihan? Here. Mr. Keeley? Here. For the controller, Mr. McGuire?
Here.
Chairperson Rosensteel, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Welcome, Gary. By phone. Press the button to say you want to speak. Feel free to speak up anytime you want to speak, and we'll make sure that it's just like you're doing. So the first item is the approval of the committee agenda and work plan. And motion to approve that. Second. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Here, Peter Perry.
Are you in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Checking to see you're still there. Okay, so item 2 is the approval of the minutes, and this is the approval of. Thank you. This is the approval of both the November 7th, 2012, and the February 6th, 2013 Audit and Risk Management Committee open session meetings. Any comments or questions about the minutes? Seeing none, do I have a motion for approval?
Move approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Please record me as abstaining.
Item 3 is the results of the 2013 Audit Services Internal Quality Assessment Review. Mary Ann?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item 3 provides the results of our most recent internal quality assessment review. We refer to it as an internal QAR. The 2013 internal QAR represents our second internal QAR performed by Audit Services since our 2011 external quality assessment review was completed. The recommendation of that external QAR was that Audit Service begin performing annual internal assessments. And I would be happy to address any questions that the committee may have over these, our results.
Any questions? Seeing none, I don't know, Dr. Yetman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mary Ann, it might be useful if you just take just maybe a minute, maybe just a really short period of time to explain the role of an internal QAR that's conducted annually versus the external QAR, which happens once every 5 years or so. Maybe you could explain to the board the relationship between those two.
Certainly. Everything we're doing from a standards perspective, our internal auditing standards, there are very specific guidelines in there about how we maintain quality, and that requires us to have a quality assurance program. That program is further defined into two components that are both internal to the audit organization, and then every 5 years to have an external quality assessment performed. The internal quality assessment is, as it states, is where we use our own internal staff to perform it. So it is somewhat of a self-evaluation, but that staff who looks at those audits are not the same auditors who performed the audit. So they truly are applying the guidelines of the IIA and checking to ensure that we have met the quality. And that result is then known as the results of the internal QAR. I hope that addresses that question.
Yeah, pretty much. One thing that's important to note is one question that naturally arises with internal QARs is, well, that's sort of us checking ourselves to some extent. You do get different people checking the audits than did the audits. But then a question arises, well, is there anyone checking the people that check themselves? And the answer is yes. That's a big role of the 5-year, because you go and get an external person to come in. And so they're sort of, and it doesn't have to be every year, of course, every 5. So I think it's important to realize that there's two sets of these going on. And a big component of the external one is to validate the results of the internal one.
I have one question on the one of the findings, the third one, that audit planning documents did not include consideration of preliminary assessment of risk, including the risk of fraud, as part of the engagement planning process. What was, I guess it would seem to me that that would be almost you couldn't go forward with an audit unless you sort of considered the risks that you were looking for in the audit. So could you explain a little bit more about that? I'm wondering whether that's, how serious a problem that was, because it seems sort of.
Honestly, that was a very serious problem, and that was from the original internal QAR that we did right after the external. From that, we immediately implemented changes. So this column here is from our first internal QAR. What you'll notice is that it was resolved in our 2013 review. That is now not the case.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, so this is just an information item, no action necessary, and we can move on then to the next item, which is item 4A, Audit Services Annual Risk Assessment Internal Audits, and back to Mary Ann.
Yes, this is, as you mentioned, item 4A, the results of our annual internal risk assessment, the results of an annual risk assessment being utilized to help us planning for future internal audits. This identifies proposed internal audits that we actually will incorporate and have incorporated into item 5, which is our updated annual audit plan. The results of that risk assessment and the process of that risk assessment is what is outlined in the agenda item. We start with, in this year, we started with what management has been doing, which is taking on its own risk assessment process. And so we build upon that, also using our professional judgment as auditors as to what audits we believe we should engage in for future internal audit purposes. So I'm happy to take any questions from the material.
Bob, do you have any comments before we
I'd
open
be
it up?
delighted, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mary Ann, just a couple questions. The first
Sure.
one is, I didn't see in here, and I'm sure it's in here somewhere, and I just missed it, but where would the spiking initiatives be looked at? For example, the compensation review unit or the hotline, are those part of the internal audits, and if so, where would they fall under?
That would be, again, an internal operation, and when we went through and looking at the various risks and factoring those risks, those particular internal operations didn't rise to our current audit plan. Does not mean they wouldn't have been considered. It just says that was not something we felt was, in our judgment, something we needed to look at in the next cycle.
And is that because they just didn't get high enough for a score?
Correct.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I don't see anybody. Harry, do you have questions?
No.
Okay. I have a question that trying to understand this process and how it's integrated with our enterprise risk management and the semi-annual risk management assessments that are brought to the full board, because when we had our risk management workshop, we decided that most of the risks were really going to be under the responsibility of the full board as opposed to ARM. So can you try to explain a little bit more what the role of audit services is versus what the role of the senior management is for the management of some of these risks? Because it's not the responsibility of audit services, for example, to ensure succession planning, but that's one of the risks of failure to do succession planning. So I'd like a little bit of an understanding, because I'm not sure what it is that Audit Services is doing versus others in the organization to manage these risks.
And let me start, and I'll turn over to Jack if he feels he wants to speak up. But managing risk is management's responsibility. Audit Services, as an internal audit shop, we are performing audits to give assurance about the actions being taken by management as whether or not they are effective or efficient in the management of that risk. So the ownership of risk, though, lies with management themselves. So the integration, taking the results of the risk assessment that management performs and utilizing it for audit planning purposes is a standard practice in internal auditing. It doesn't stop at that point, but it is a good starting point, because management has acknowledged and taken the time to acknowledge that there is risk in the business organization. And internal audits then performs a function of giving an independent assessment as to how well that risk is being managed. Similar to what you would be looking for from the external audit perspective as well. They are, again, giving you a further independent review of how well management is managing risk. With regard to how the enterprise level management is being, that process is moving forward. I'm not sure, Jack, if you want to add any more to that.
No, other than we've begun that institutionalization of the, in our case, it's a quarterly meeting, not the semi-annual reporting to you. Yeah, to us, we're gearing up, and we've done that exercise at least 2 or 3 times now, so that's getting some rhythm to it. But to me, that now becomes constructive fodder, for lack of a better word, for you to be, if we're saying it's important and we're worried, then
Right.
then you should be worried and be thinking about it. So I guess that's the handoff that I guess I see between the two processes.
And so then is the determination of what Audit Services audits based on what senior staff identifies as the biggest enterprise risks, or is that something that Audit Services is independently making a determination about?
I would say we take it with a great deal of importance, that if there's a strong concern by management, that it would make sense to put your internal audit resources towards that. At the same time, though, it's got to be something that when I have to consider my own staff skills and knowledge, and frankly, is it something that is auditable? Is it something being controlled that is within the control of the business organization or outside the business organization? Therefore, I'm not in a position, from being the internal auditor for CalSTRS, to be looking to audit another organization that has nothing directly related to CalSTRS.
Is there anything on this list of issues to audit that perhaps is because you've made the determination that there's a risk here, but you made that determination, and maybe senior staff doesn't think that it's as great a risk or is everything just kind of consistent with the prioritization of what senior staff says are the biggest risks?
I should say we added to that is not only senior management's assessment, but then we are asked them to drill down into their business operations, which we describe in here. So it starts at that high level. We're still drilling down into individual business units. And I fully feel it's continuing to evolve. Right now, we didn't see, nothing came up on our radar screen that we felt we needed to add in addition to that, but that's certainly our purview and our responsibility to not just stop with what management has assessed, but also any information we have as auditors.
And I guess one last question on that then is, does that also then mean that this committee could determine that there's something that we think Audit Services should be auditing?
Absolutely.
Okay. Richard, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had a couple questions, and I'm on page 28. On the table, the top row, business objective 6, sub-risk 6B, as well as the third row, business objective 6, sub-risk 6A. So a second ago, it sounded like you said things that are sort of outside the operations control are kind of outside of things that you would audit, if I heard you correctly. And these two items, as they relate to external legislation and reform proposals, seem to be sort of external things. And I'm just curious how that fits into a potential audit activity within CalSTRS. It seems like it's somewhat different from what I would envision as, and what you described earlier as sort of audit functions that you perform today. So if you could just speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. What this is on here for is that management has identified some risk mitigation effort that they are going, and this comes from the system level review, some level of effort that they're going to put on it. By putting on this audit plan, and you'll notice it's not highlighted, it says we would consider it, that would be exactly the type of consideration we'd be making, which is, is this something that truly could be audited, is within CalSTRS control? This simply was a disclosure from previous risk assessments that the question came up, could we see the whole list? And so I wanted to fully disclose, there's a long list here, but it does not necessarily mean that every single item on it will be subject to audit and/or subject to audit in the next cycle. We make that assessment as we go along.
So this is more of just a running inventory of potential things, but not necessarily something that you would spend audit resources on.
But we want to be transparent to say if there was something that, again, we've highlighted what is on our plan and we put it on our plan, but as pointed out earlier, if the committee felt there was something, hey, I really would have an interest that I'd like to see an audit done of that versus the other, I want to take that into consideration.
Thanks.
All right.
I don't see any other comments. Harry, any questions before we move on?
I'm good, Paul, thanks.
Okay. So, let's see. I think with that, then we can move on to the next item, which is the item 4B, Audit Services Annual Risk Assessment of Employer Audits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item 4B is the presentation of the results of the latest annual risk assessment of reporting employers that we perform as audit services. The risk assessment is performed for the purpose of developing our audit plan related to employer audits. And what is outlined here is the process by which we go through on an annual basis to select a pool of potential employers' audits that we will perform. With that, I'm happy to address any questions on the risk assessment.
Mary Ann, I hope you indulge me. I have several questions here.
Sure.
Hopefully don't expose my ignorance, but, here goes. On ARM 32, it's the risk factors and the description and the weights with respect to 8 various risk factors, and it's very nicely done. I did have a couple of questions. My first one is, item 3, the special compensation of $1,000 or more. Is that $1,000 for the whole year for an individual? So to get that score, to get a tick on that score, one person has to have a $1,000 special compensation? And the reason I ask is $1,000. If that's the case, $1,000 seems small relative to the $100,000 threshold in number 2. But maybe I don't understand how special is.
Actually, if you look down a little bit further to the next bullet, I believe this question came up, and it wasn't by you, Dr. Yetman. It was previously we presented this, and we wanted to further explain. So, for example, an employer reporting compensation of $1,000 or more for 10 members. That $1,000 is an individual transaction, but it's also this factoring takes into account how many members. So in this example, I was giving, if there was a $1,000 transaction for 10 members, it might be given a 1 versus another reporting entity that had 400 members being reported as 1,000. As you can imagine, we have a large number of transactions that take place. So this is our filtering process.
So is it fair to say that these, because 20% is a big part of the weight, right? So is it
Yes.
fair to say that in your opinion, these special items, there seems to be significant a lot of problems associated with these special items? Is that?
This is a risk area where we have historically had some non-compliance issues. So that is why it's a factor.
Thank you. My next question is number 8.
Mm-hmm.
So the prior findings, sort of the repeat offender scoring. That's a terrible word to use. Let me just say a subsequent finding or repeated findings. 5%, you can't assign more than 100%. I get that, but why is only 5% for repeated? Because it's my memory isn't as what it used to be, but I do recall that if a school district had some problems in the prior year, that's a pretty good predictor of having problems in subsequent years until they sort of get things cleared up. And so if that's an indicator, then I was just wondering why only 5% is given to subsequent years' findings and not more.
That's a fair question. Again, this is something new. We decided to start bringing into our factoring this year the results of prior audits. Unfortunately, or fortunately for depending upon your perspective, our history of employer audits, we don't have that many of them. So it was a judgment we made not to give it a huge weight simply because we don't have a lot of history to throw to it.
That's reasonable. I would suggest to the board that if it does appear that there's a pattern, if you sort of see it going on year after year, then you could reconsider, not necessarily have to do it, but maybe reconsider the weight on that one issue. Thank you. And then in addition to that, is that whether or not they had findings, or does that incorporate the dollar amount of the findings?
Right now, we only consider they had findings.
I would suggest to the board that you could consider including another variable or adding into this the dollar amount of the findings. So, if it was $1,000 off last year, that's not a big deal, but if it was a lot, it's a bigger deal. Just a thought. I have a question on table 2. So I did some math on these to see what percentage of community colleges, K-12, and charters are in the high-risk category. And according to my math, which isn't as good as some but better than others, 43% of the community colleges were high risk, and only 8% of the K-12 schools, and 0% of the charters. So my question there, the question that naturally arises is the method used to assign the risk, are community colleges, K-12 schools, and charter schools somehow different that you don't necessarily want the same set of risk factors? In other words, is it fair to say that community colleges are, boy, they're really risky, whereas charter schools aren't risky at all? Or is it possible that that a different set of risk factors is needed for each of those groups? Am I making any sense? Okay, thanks.
Were you asking me or the board?
Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
No, I would agree that we need to visit on an ongoing basis the results of these risk assessments. One of the items I would point to, and we haven't got to it yet, but that we are specifically focusing on community colleges and will continue to do so in the next year. And I believe the results of that will allow us to have additional data metrics to consider in doing these risk assessments. So your comment that should we be doing segregated risk assessments based on the type is always something that's in the forefront of our mind. We just need more input at this point to say, well, where do we want to go to?
Would you be looking to the board for such input, or probably management? Or
I would say a combination.
yeah, okay. Let's see. 2010. Since you brought up the community college, on ARM 33 is you say something about at the request of Plan Design Communication Branch and in conjunction with the Community College Task Force, Audit Services agreed to conduct audits of the community colleges during that year. So is that something new?
Actually, it was introduced the last year. So yes, it's still new, and we're continuing it on into the 14. We wanted to look at it from a 2-year cycle.
Any questions from anyone else? Grant?
Thank you. I didn't before, but after Dr. Yetman spoke, I have a couple of questions. On Table 2, K through 12 charter schools, does that include both independent and charter schools that are chartered through a district?
These are independent, I
Okay.
believe. I'm going to make sure my staff agrees with me before I misspoke. But these are independent. They're reporting through a district. They're combined in with the K-12.
I mean, before, in the past, we've had special task force look at reporting issues for charter schools. So my assumption has always been that, there's a good percentage that are high risk, and yet the ones here, it looks like there's 0 that are in the high risk category. So I wondered, is there, but that charter schools does include all of the charter schools, whether they're independent or,
The line here, K through 12 charter schools would be an independent charter school. The K through 12, where a charter school is being reported through a district, would be part of K-12 line.
okay. And then
Keep
on
me
the
honest.
issue on ARM 32, number 8, on the prior employer audits with findings, 5% weighting, we also, if they have prior findings, we follow up until they correct,
Absolutely.
right? So that gives me a little more comfort in terms of if we're only weighting them 5% right now, we're at least following up. So that's it.
All right.
I have a couple of questions also on Table 2. So there will be 53 audits done, right?
Yes.
And 10% will be in the low-risk employer pool. So probably about 5 audits of 867 schools. And then 20% will be in the medium risk, so probably 10 or 11 audits of 499 schools. And then 70% will be in the high risk, which would be about 37 audits of 69 schools. So we're auditing more than every other school in the high risk. And I'm wondering, what is the, first of all, I think, we talked, Bob raised a good question about charter schools. None of them are in the high risk, and almost all of them are in the low risk. Is it likely that we wouldn't audit any charter schools? In other words, if you're gonna audit 5 in the low risk, how do you decide which 5? Is it just random, or would you make sure that you're auditing, 2 K-12 and 2 charter schools because that's where the preponderance is?
I wish it was that simple. That's a place to start. We also have to consider, I have to consider my staffing. So I've had a large number of new auditors come in, so I wouldn't be recommending that a brand new auditor coming in the door take on some of our more complex audits. So we talk in generalities here, but certainly the other comment I would make is we do also focus and get enough of a pool that we consider not only the fact that they're, just because they come out low risk does not mean that there will not be any issues come out of them. It just helps us to sort through and say, we need a systematic way of identifying and utilizing those resources to the maximum effort. So that being said, charter schools could be audited, yes.
Could be, but in other words, it's more it's driven by your staffing and your staff's capabilities.
For the next year,
Yeah,
again,
okay.
that's where I would be making those judgments that says that does not mean a charter school will not be audited. I just don't want to promise that it would be every charter school, that all of our low risk will be charter schools. It simply would be a determination of what is my staffing's capability at that point to get a wide range of various school types.
My other question is if 70%, which works out to then like 37 audits, is done of 69 school districts, what do we have any information, data, insight into whether a school district that gets audited then starts to do a better job so that it doesn't need to be audited as often?
I would certainly hope that will be the case. I would say at this point, because of the history of employer audits, we are embarking on some new ground here, both in increased staffing and increased effort. So the history in the past, while an indicator, we've also upped the way we look at our employer audits and employers in conducting the audit, and frankly, we're just going to get better at it.
You know, the reason it just seems to me that the reasons for auditing, for choosing a school to put it into high risk, medium, or low, you know, only 5% of it is that there were prior audit findings. All the rest don't necessarily indicate there's any problem with that district. It's just, well, I guess they're sort of out of the normal range of some of these indicators. But I just wonder whether over time, you know, to be auditing 50% of the high risk schools and you know, 0.5% of the low risk schools, whether over time the high risk schools will all get audited, and we can get more comfortable that they're doing things right and shift more resources elsewhere. It just seems a little bit excessive on the high risk.
I think over time, by its very nature, there will be districts that, when they're audited, that next cycle, they will drop in risk simply because they have been audited, and we have found, and following up on them, they have in fact corrected. But with 1,600 school employers and just the change in personnel that may occur at any given time, it's a moving target.
Paul, may I ask a
Yes.
question, please? A follow-up on some of the comments from the committee members and from Mr. Yatman. We were before you were talking about different types of assessment tools for different types of entities and gathering metrics to create those different assessment tools.
Correct.
Would you be doing that also for charter schools?
Yes.
So one of the questions that was asked was, there's a perception of risk here, and so right now we don't have a differentiated assessment tool, do we? Or
Differentiated by school type?
by school type?
No.
So eventually we would develop that, and that
Yes.
might actually address some of
Yes.
the issues.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one manifestation of the 70-20-10, and you are exactly correct in pointing out that it's both Table 1 and Table 2 together. Really, what they say is, geez, if you're a really big school district, it's basically size correlated here almost perfectly. The odds are really high you're going to get audited. And that sort of flows from an underlying belief of what the audit is about. And Mary Ann's in a better position to speak to that, and so is Jack, but I'll share with you what my thoughts are on that. And they're good thoughts. I mean, well, I don't know if they're good thoughts, but they're, I think that it's in the right place, and here's why. Audits have lots of roles to play. One of them is a deterrent, which is to say, well, we're going to scare you, right? If you see someone get audited next to you, that's going to scare you into doing the right thing. That is one approach, one way to view an audit. I prefer to view an audit, and it's my belief that CalSTRS Audit Services views departments in a different way. Use them primarily as a tool to assist the school districts in doing the right thing. Going into the audit, the attitude is, well, the school district is trying to do the right thing. It's just there's a lot of complicating factors, a lot of moving parts, and mistakes are made here and there. And so if we go to the school districts where mistakes are most likely to happen and have a big effect, that's the big school districts. Because a systematic mistake that's being made can be made again and again and again, hundreds or even thousands of times. So if the goal of an audit is really as a device to assist the school districts in complying with the complex set of laws, then you're naturally going to try to hit the biggest school districts repeatedly to make sure they get down that path. Whereas if your goal is to sort of put a little fear into everyone, well, then maybe you're more likely to even it out and try to audit all the tiers sort of more evenly. And so in my opinion, I'm quite happy with the overweighted on the large ones, because I think it reflects an underlying attitude of we're not out there to get you. We're not trying to scare anyone. It's really more of an assessment tool and an assistance mechanism. We're going to come down there and we're going to help you comply with these complex set of rules. And I think it's important to have that relationship with the school districts, because an audit sounds atrocious. No one likes to get an audit at all. And so I think that's where these numbers sort of flow from, is that underlying philosophy of what's the goal of these audits underlying.
Is that true that the high risk tend to be the larger districts? Because
Yes.
that's not, I mean, the criteria itself, except for number 6, doesn't really directly address that. You know, they are more things like
Yeah, it truly does, because again, what we're
compensation
doing
is higher than average.
its compensation is higher, and they're frankly they have a greater material impact on the system.
Sure, in other words, what I'm saying is, looking at these 8 risk factors, there's only one that is specific to the size of the district, but.
No, actually, all of them could potentially be. They're further weighted. Factoring is what I was describing in the bullet below the table. So there's the number, and then there's the volume of those numbers, and that's where it starts to differentiate and say, okay, you have 400 of these transactions, and somebody else has 1.
Right.
That can have a greater systemic problem for the system.
Sure. Jack?
Just, I want to add one piece to the discussion I don't think we've mentioned is, I think the job of the auditors here is clearly, obviously, to be attentive to the risk and making sure that we are keeping to schedule and assessing and going in and doing the analysis Mary Ann's talking about. But it will never be such a perfect world that over time these organizations will be on that right track in perpetuity. I mean, there is always employee turnover, computer systems change, business rules change. So especially for these very large bureaucratic organizations, there is so much organizational chaos, I guess, for lack of a better word, that there will always be things that are missed over time. So that's probably why we would have audit staff, not just for a year or 2 years, but attentive to some of the most complex school systems. But I guess I kind of see it like working with a patient. If Mary Ann's staff are the heart surgeons and trying to stabilize the patient, Peggy's staff are the primary care doctors here, and they're looking at the data that comes from that analysis. And her staff, through our member account services unit, have employer representatives that are then educating that employer on a regular basis. So there needs to be a feedback loop here to make it really work well, not just go in an audit, criticize someone, issue the findings, hope they do better, but it's got to feedback to the primary care doctors, to say with that analogy, that go back and do that education with the employers. And that, to me, keeps the patient healthy. There you go.
And I guess my only question is sort of, 60% of the schools are categorized as low risk, and they've got a virtually 0% chance of being audited, because we're only going to do 5 audits. So does the whole process of employer audits really have any impact, one way or another at all, on those 60% of the districts that we're classifying as low risk? And so either in terms of helping them, or in terms of having their behavior be affected by the risk of an audit? That's my, you know.
And again, it's a fair question. One of the things I would add, and it piggybacks onto what Jack is saying, whenever we are completing an audit, and frankly, when we're done with an audit, we are circling back through the member areas of the system, and in fact, having that dialogue. And I think I had mentioned in the last meeting that we're actually engaging on a quarterly update with our the education member and, employer education and training, so that where we see systemic problems, we're engaging them and telling them, hey, why don't we update our education and emphasize the things we're seeing out there in the audit?
I think it'd be interesting to get feedback as to, you know, by these different categories, what are the audit findings? In other words, can you make some generalizations about, you know, what the findings were in the low risk, the medium risk, and the high risk? And I think that'd be some useful feedback for the committee once these, you know, at the end of the year.
I totally agree.
But something has changed for the better here, I would say, these last couple of years. I mean, when Ed and I visit with the professional associations of business officials and those that are doing the management of these organizations, audits were never really much of a topic of discussion. But this has created a buzz, some of the strong findings that have come forth this last 2 years, I would say. And now they're bringing that up with us in terms of what's the process around this and what are you focused on, what are you concerned about. So it does tell me that there's a group discussion going on informally that tells you there's an effect. So that's good. That's what we want.
Richard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Jack, a minute ago, you mentioned that sort of the feedback between the employer services and the audit side.
Yes.
Does feedback from the employer services come back in the form of, hey, we're seeing, just by the questions we're getting from a particular employer, that something strange is going on here? There seems to be a lack of knowledge or, you know, in a particular, and is that factored into a decision to add somebody to a later audit?
Yeah, Peggy and Peter's here. Oh, you're right there. Peter, do you want to come up and talk? Peter heads up our member services area and can kind of talk about the data intelligence that comes from the work that goes in that area and how it informs the organization. Does that make sense? Sure. Yeah, thanks. It's Peter Haley.
The Director of Member Account Services that handles the employer reporting process. And one of our concepts that we use there is that for the employer reporting, we also have the employer training piece and the business readiness piece that we work directly with the employers. Once we find out information from those employers that there is a need for training in that area, we go out there and we do an assessment. We then feed back to audits to say, here's the issue that we're seeing with a given employer, or maybe actually a different region. And we made sure that they include that information when they're doing their assessment to perhaps include that given employer into the audit itself or into the audit plan.
And if I could add one more item, whenever we start an employer audit, we are actually seeking and reaching out to the member service area to give us feedback before we even step into the field about that particular employer and their experience with that employer.
So you're really using the information they gather through their normal process to sort of inform and guide your audit activity. That's great.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes.
And if I may, thank you, Peggy Platt, Deputy CEO for Benefits and Services. Several years ago, we created a new employer portal reporting process, our secure employer website. We worked extensively with the employers in the design and development of that website, and we shifted responsibility for the accuracy of data from CalSTRS to monitor to the employers to manage. And we did use information about frequent audit findings as part of that design. So we have significantly reduced some of the most common audit findings for the period following implementation of the Secure Employer website. And Audit Services hasn't yet caught up with that full implementation period because they're looking back 3 years. So we're just now getting to that point where we have 3 full years of data from the use of our new Secure Employer website. And we believe that many of the issues that we found in the past related to member, non-member are going away because employers have access to tools and are required to use those tools anytime someone comes on board in a position that could qualify for membership. So we deliberately took common audit findings and factored them into the employer responsibilities in the design of that system.
Great.
Thank you.
Harry, before we move on, any questions
No,
from you?
Paul, your questions and Grant's questions were a couple of the ones that I had, so I'm fine.
Okay, great.